Hello, I'm Michael Bott.
And I'm Rupert Soskin. Welcome to another Prehistory Guys interview, introducing you to archaeologists and historians all too often hidden behind the scenes and finding out what they're up to while the world isn't watching.
Today we're talking with Dr Lee Bray, lead archaeologist for the Dartmoor National Park in Devon, southwest England.
Yeah, Lee started out in geology before making the move into archaeology and on to Exeter University, where he gained his doctorate in Romano British Iron production on Exmoor.
Now, Dartmoor is a special place for us, so we're very much looking forward to this conversation with Dr Bray, who is possibly, in our humble opinion, the best job that there may be in archaeology. However, before we begin, don't forget that if you're interested in our interviews and other films and broadcasts, you can find much more content on our Patreon campaign page at patreon.com/The Prehistory Guys. Not least of all, an extended version of this interview with our guest today. There's almost another half hour of this show available to you, and loads more exclusive content as well if you become a supporter of the Prehistory Guys on Patreon.
Also, as so many of our fans have demanded, we have at last now started work on creating a sequel to our acclaimed film Standing with Stones. Now, obviously, this is a massive project, and your help in achieving this next goal would be hugely appreciated. So do hop over and take a look at our Patreon page. We would love to welcome you as partners in this exciting adventure.
Yeah, we hope to see you around in the community. In the meantime, don't you think? I think we better say hello to our guest and get on with the show.
I think we should. Dr Lee Bray, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you here. What's the weather like down in sunny Exeter?
A bit dull, but we did have a very light sprinkling of snow this morning, which is very unusual in Exeter. I mean, Devon doesn't get it generally, apart from the moors, but to have it in Exeter is really unusual.
And here you are indoors instead of on the moors.
Yes, I'm not too displeased about that, given how cold it is out there. So I think the wind chill's about -10 on Dartmoor at the moment. With
is
wind
it really?
Chill. Yeah, it's not warm.
Well, in that case, we're glad to be saving you from unpleasantness.
It would be a Dartmoor pony.
Yeah, no.
Well, Lee, we always start these interviews off because people do love to know. The first question is always, what is it that got you into archaeology in the first place?
Well, I've always, ever since being young, been interested in the past and visiting places. But when I was in a former life, if you like, I was a geologist. That was my first degree, if you like, first 2 degrees really. I did a postgraduate master's in geology as well, and spent the 90s working in the oil industry. But I guess most people buy a motorbike or, get a tattoo or something. But I decided I was going to go back to university and study archaeology. And the thing that actually prompted me to do that, this is going to sound corny, but the thing that really pushed me over the edge, as it were, was watching Time Team. I mean, many archaeologists are quite sniffy about Time Team, but for me, it was instrumental in my career choice, and instrumental, I think, in the popularity of archaeology as a discipline today with the general public. I think Mick Aston, the late Mick Aston, said, well, you don't see a young accountants club, do you? And that speaks volumes to me. So, but yeah, Time Team would be the single most single factor, really, the greatest factor, I guess. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, but what was your academic path then, Lee? Into archaeology from that?
My original one was geology at Kingston, what is now Kingston University, but was then Kingston Polytechnic. And then a few years later, I did a master's in mineral exploration at Royal School of Mines, Imperial College in London. And then I did my undergraduate and then a PhD in archaeology at Exeter University. So,
okay.
What was your doctorate?
That was Roman ironworking on Exmoor, or Romano British ironworking on Exmoor. Iron production on Exmoor was that's what I studied.
Right.
the moorlands have always figured strongly, but Roman archaeology, sort of Roman ironworking, it harks back to my geological background as well.
Fascinating stuff. Well, you know what? We have so many of our viewers they're all over the world. Particularly, we've got a lot of people over in the United States, for example, and so a lot of them don't actually know about Dartmoor itself anyway. So, can you give us a bit of a background on the context of Dartmoor? What is it? What makes it different? What makes it special? Its geology, and it's the history of the land itself, which will give a better context for human history.
Well, Dartmoor's history really starts somewhere in the region of 270 to 300 million years ago, with, at that time, what is now southwest Britain, the bit that sticks out at the bottom of the UK, was at the bottom of a very deep ocean. And in terms of plate tectonics, that ocean was slowly closing, which meant that all the sediments, huge depths of sediments in the bottom of that ocean, were thrust up into a massive mountain chain, something on the scale of the Himalayas today, which stretched from, certainly from southwest Britain into Brittany. The Brittany in France has a very similar geology. And into the roots of those mountains, all this upheaval going on, was thrust this huge mass of molten rock, which slowly cooled over millions of years to become the granite of which Dartmoor is formed. But Dartmoor's only a very small part of that granite mass, because it really forms the spine, if you like, of Devon and Cornwall that stick out at the bottom, and also the Scilly Isles. It stretches way out into the Atlantic, and all we see today are the very tops of that granite being exposed by weathering. After all those mountains I was speaking of, they've all been eroded away over millions of years to expose this granite at the roots. And because the granite is really hard and tough, it doesn't weather as quickly as the surrounding rocks, so it forms uplands, and those are dotted down the length of Devon and Cornwall. Dartmoor is the largest and the most eastern of those granite masses, granite bosses, I think you might call them, sticking out at the top.
Good word.
And that really has shaped Dartmoor's subsequent history, because it's always been an upland ever since it's been exposed, which means it's subject to very different climatic conditions, and its materials are different. The granite itself is hard, and that's one of the reasons why we have so much archaeology on Dartmoor. That, combined with its upland character, means that although people have lived there and operated there for centuries and millennia, it's never been as intensely worked as it has in the lowlands, where agriculture has effaced a lot of the archaeology and a lot of the remains of the past. They get recycled constantly. That doesn't happen on Dartmoor, not to the same extent. So you have granite, and a relative lack of human activity or intensity of activity have left us with this wonderful record of the human past.
And that would be the human past since the Ice Age, I get. I suppose. How far did the ice extend down to Dartmoor?
That's a good question, and a source of great debate at the moment among geomorphologists and glaciologists. It's a debate we've accidentally contributed to. Some geomorphologists have been out on Dartmoor looking at some of the landforms and saying, these look a bit glacial in places. Did Dartmoor have small ice caps in the last ice age? And we were excavating some years ago now at Sitterford Stone Circle, which is near Sitterford Tor and Fernworthy, that eastern part of the moor. And we'd taken off the peat and the underlying the old fossilised soil, and we were down onto what we saw to be the natural substrate, the weathered bedrock. But it didn't look like anything we'd see usually on granite. Usually we have a material called groen, which is a yellow sandy material, rotted down granite. But this wasn't like that. This was a lot finer. And we had an academic from Plymouth University visiting, because he was doing some sampling for us. He took one look at it and said, that looks like glacial till.
Amazing.
So we've accidentally contributed to that debate on whether or not Dartmoor had any ice caps. Now,
well, we'll come back to Sittaford Stone Circle, I bet, later on. But in the meantime, obviously, we can only speak to human activity on Dartmoor post whatever glaciation that may have been. And of course, we're talking about Mesolithic activity. In the Mesolithic, do you think that the Dartmoor area would have been quite as well defined an area as it is now, as we can see now?
Possibly not. I mean, because in the wake of the Ice Age, during the Ice Age, before 10,000-ish years BC, the place would have been tundra or covered in ice caps, whichever side of that debate you come down on. But after that ended, we had rapid climatic warming, which meant that over several thousand years, trees spread across the landscape up from southern Europe, and it changed the landscape totally. And with those trees came hunter-gatherers. But Dartmoor wouldn't have been an exception. It would have been covered in trees. A forested landscape, perhaps except for the highest points of the ground, which would have been rather more heath-like like they are today, really. It may have been somewhat different because somewhat more like Wistman's Wood, if you've ever been there, where we have sort of rather, I forget the actual name of the oak species, but they don't grow as big as mighty oaks. Don't think of the landscape as being covered in mighty oak trees or anything. It would have been rather more scrub-like, forested, but and dense, but less tall and full, perhaps. So,
and what is the evidence for human activity in the Mesolithic?
The Mesolithic is a period which we know there was activity because we have flint scatters that these people have left behind them in many parts of Dartmoor. They're not all Mesolithic, some of them are later, but we know there's a Mesolithic component to them. The problem is it's not very well studied. We contrast with our neighbour Exmoor over that, where quite a lot of work has been undertaken on the Mesolithic, so they know an awful lot about what was going on. Here on Dartmoor, we don't know very much at all. But we are trying to rectify that. We have, very soon, Leicester University, in conjunction with Dartmoor, we have a PhD student starting who will start to study some of our, what we call lithic tools, some of that evidence. So with luck, we should know a little bit more about that in a few years, which will point the way for future research, I hope.
Right. Fascinating stuff. Well, there is so much history or prehistory that we could talk about here. So I'm almost not even going to try to make this chronological. It's just it's how it leaps out. One of the things that we're quite passionate about one way or another is stone rows. And the thing is, Dartmoor has got more stone rows than anywhere else in the British Isles, hasn't it?
I think it's something like 60% of England's stone rows.
It's astonishing, isn't it? And the thing is that it's amazing, really, when there's such a concentration of them on Dartmoor, and yet they still remain a complete and utter mystery to us. Now, you are one of the few individuals, you've probably spent more time with stone rows than most of the rest of the human population. So
quite a lot.
Have you put together, do you have any thoughts or ideas yourself on what purpose they may have served?
The first thing to say about that is our dating of stone rows is rather sketchy. They are generally thought to fall somewhere in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, so around 2,500 years BC. So late Neolithic, early Bronze Age, that sort of period. That's the generally accepted view, but there's a proviso to that. I mean, usually that's because they're very often associated with cairns, which are, we're fairly confident, are an early Bronze Age phenomenon mostly.
Yes.
However, they are incredibly hard to date directly. In advance of clay waste deposition on southern Dartmoor, back in the 70s or 80s, I forget exactly when, but that sort of time ago, an entire stone row was excavated at Cholwich Town. I think
really?
I'm pronouncing that correctly,
Golly.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But no dating evidence whatsoever was found.
Really?
Oh,
These things are I mean, the same applies to most sort of things like stone circles, is that what you have is a stone set in a socket, usually, and there's not much you can date there unless you're very lucky and find something in the socket. And even then, you can never be sure that the stone hasn't been removed and put back at some point.
Again, yeah.
True.
So our data on dating is really quite sparse. And now we add to that, back in about 10 years ago, a monument or a feature was spotted on Cut Hill, which is one of the most remote parts of Dartmoor, right on the northern moor, where there were a series of recumbent stones lying down. They're not standing up, but they were in a line that disappeared under the peat. So we're not sure the extent of this, but it looks for all the world like a stone row that's not standing anymore. And Ralph Fife, academic at Plymouth University, and Tom Greaves, who's also a Dartmoor scholar, did some work there where they went out to Cut Hill and they looked at two of these stones and looked at the peat underneath them that they were lying on top of. And now that peat you can date because it's organic material. You can take it away and do some radiocarbon dating on it. So that's what they did with two of these stones. And both those dates, what that date will tell you is how long that stone has been lying on that peat, because no other peat has accumulated. Directly underneath both of those stones, the peat came back with a date of 3,500 years BC. So 1,000 years earlier than we were thinking.
Yeah.
That's the date that the stones were lying down and it had gone out of use, presumably. Now, there are problems with dating peat. Lots of technical difficulties I don't fully understand. But what that tells us is we've got to be cautious about these monuments. And it also tells us that potentially they have a huge time depth in which they were in use. Yeah. That's a very long period of time if we are looking at monuments like that still being built 1,000 years after they start.
I think that's something that I really want people to get an impression of. Dartmoor is a very special place because to a certain extent it is preserved. All that it's got to give us is kind of preserved in aspic, if you like, because it's undeveloped and all those kinds of things. And so what we're looking through is a lens going very deep in prehistory. And so we look at Dartmoor, we see kists, we see stone rows, we see stone circles. In our mind's eye, they all get collapsed together.
Yeah, they're telescoped, aren't they? All into one horizon, if you like.
That's right. And whereas the true story is of occupation over, a vast period of time. If you include the Mesolithic, then it's, a silly time period. But even if you just take it from the beginning of the Neolithic up to, the early Bronze Age, it's still an extraordinary amount of time in which to put all these monuments and break them down and so on and so forth, which is why Sittaford Stone Circle and Cut Hill are so important, because previously it's been in guesswork. So I mean, if you got more to say about that aspect of it and what's come out from the archaeology of that generally.
I mean, apart from looking at a landscape and looking at all the features in it and how they are an accumulation, really, we're seeing a final position, and there's no guarantee that all those monuments were in use at the same time. That's one factor of that. The other is individual monuments. Take any monument you like, and if they are as long-lived as some of them are, their meanings change over time, almost certainly, to their users. They mean different things to the people who used them and built them, and also their forms change. And each individual monument will have changed its shape and what it consisted of over time. So you've got that added layer of complexity when you're trying to understand what they're about. The analogy I always think of in my head is our churches in our landscape today. When they were built, they were very strongly about Christianity. They may also have been about something new that was replacing something old. They would also have been much more perhaps centres of the community than they are now. But if you then project that over time, they will have had all sorts of meanings over that time. They will have been changed and adapted, rebuilt, demolished, just added to, taken away from. And then in more recent times, we're in a position now where many of them are being used for other functions.
Yes.
I've actually attended in the past. I've attended in a church medieval sword fighting lessons, European martial arts lessons. So very weird and different things going on in churches, and they're a very good analogy to something like, say, a stone row or a cairn, which has changed its shape and probably its function and what people thought about it over time. Yeah. So that's the analogy I always have in my mind.
Yeah, but that's so true, especially when you think that some of them have deconsecrated and people are actually they've changed them into apartments and Lord knows what. So what future archaeologists will make of all that?
Well, exactly. I mean, in France, I know there are bunkers from the Atlantic Wall that people are living in. They've converted to houses. So very, we're still doing the same things, but with different. They've got very different meanings and uses now. And if you're looking at a monument that's been in use for 1,000, take Stonehenge is the classic example. It's changed and altered over the course of 1,500 years, and it's been in use for that length of time. There's no way that it meant exactly the same thing to the people who were using it in its latter stages that it meant to the people who built it. Very different things. It must have been. So, that's an automatic assumption you have to make, I think, when trying to understand what these monuments might have been about. The original question was what Stone Row's about. I've gone way off that now. But if I go back to that one, you're in your video on standing with stones. I've forgotten the title. I've been watching that.
Yeah, that's the one.
I love the way you just write off the astronomical alignments, because I'm completely with you there. I think it's it's not. I don't agree or see much in that myself either. That's not to say that they're not aligned on things in the landscape that may have been significant to people. So that's one thing. You also talk about processional ways, and that's another that I've seen them discussed as being metaphors in a processional metaphor, if you like, from birth, where you have the terminal stone across one end of the monument. You walk along it, which is a metaphor for life, and at the end of it, you've got a cairn, which is funereal, and that's death. So I've seen that discussed. I've heard people talk about the different shapes of the stones and how there are two basic shapes of a pole or pillar type one with a flatter fin-shaped one. Those are the broad shape, and you can sort of see that if you look at them. And they've talked about those in terms of night and day, in terms of male and female. Perhaps they represent individual people, things we can't access now. So those are all very valid ideas, but one that's captured my imagination recently, and it just strikes me as something that as archaeologists and people who think about the past, we've completely missed. It's in the title of what we're discussing here, prehistory. That means there's no history, which means there's no written record. People at this time didn't have writing, so they had no way of recording things. Not easily, anyway. And there's an academic in Australia, Lynn MacDonald. I think it's Lynn MacDonald, or have I got a Lynn something? Oh dear, I can't remember her name. That's terrible.
Don't worry, we'll pop it up.
That name rings a bell. I'm sure we've been in communication with
Lynn MacDonald is the historian who wrote about the First World War, I think. It's Lynn something. Right. Oh dear.
I've got her book Kelly?
Lynn Kelly, that's it.
Lynn Kelly.
Yes, that's the one.
Yes, she used one. She used our reconstruction of Stanton Drew in her book.
Oh, did she? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I do like her ideas about memory, and how, particularly Stone Rose, I think, could be analogous to a material memory palace, if you like, what Sherlock's supposed to do on the television, where he this Greek technique for remembering things. Yes. And when you can, Lynn Kelly says about in her writing about how traditional societies, without writing, all of them have sophisticated technologies for remembering the things they need to remember to survive.
Yes. Yeah.
Where the animals are, when you plant your seeds, who's related to who, going back generations. All these things need to be remembered to maximise chances of survival and prosperity. And it might be that some of our monuments, like Stone rows may have had a function like that. And you can see how they might. If you walk along them, you've got this shaped stone, it reminds you of this. So you have to, that automatically triggers a remembering of different sorts of information. I mean, these are all ideas, and all of them are valid and may be simultaneously valid. They're not mutually exclusive usually.
Sure.
So
sure.
I
That's
think
very true, yeah.
monuments are very sophisticated and very complicated things, and I think anyone pushing a single interpretation of them is almost certainly barking up the wrong tree. But any insight is a good insight, if you see what I mean. I always liken it to studying prehistory is a bit like being a frog sitting on a lily pad in the middle of a pond. And every time he jumps halfway to the edge of the pond, which means he'll never ever reach the edge of the pond, but he'll get closer. And for me, that's what studying prehistory's like.
Yeah. Nice analogy.
There was a lovely quote that I heard on one of your talks when you said that history is just a subset of archaeological information. And I thought, don't want to upset anybody, but right on.
I was being inflammatory deliberately there. That's something one of my tutors once said to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. But again, Dartmoor, the funny thing about Dartmoor is that there's just so much archaeology and there's nothing grandiose. So you don't get the impressions of high status anything, and then suddenly you've got the kist at White Horse Hill.
Yeah.
And now I would love you to tell our viewers and listeners a bit about how that discovery actually came about and the Friday afternoon panic and everything that came out of that excavation, because it is quite extraordinary.
It is. Well, it's a discovery of international importance, really. It's way beyond, its significance goes way beyond Dartmoor.
Right.
It's unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, given the stress that was probably involved, I wasn't in post at the time it was found. All I did was come into post and deal with the book launch. That was my job. It was my predecessor who had the excitement and the stress of dealing with such a discovery. But the story goes is that the kist had been identified in the late 90s, I think. Eroding out of the face, a peat face on Hanging Stone Hill or White Horse Hill. They're close together. And it had been noted, and it was noted the erosion was carrying on. And so the National Park tried to prevent the erosion and by building a dry stone wall across this face of peat. But 10 years later, it became clear that was failing. And it was decided that we're going to need to excavate this to make sure that, there's nothing in it. No one was expecting anything because it had been exposed to the air for a while, and they duly set to excavate, got everybody in place, we're excavating, and I'm relaying other people's stories to you now. It was a Friday afternoon, and this is typical archaeology. The weather was going to close in over the weekend, and they had this kist open on the moor on Friday afternoon, and they knew the weather was coming in, so they were trying to get things done and get things into a position where they could leave it. Nobody found anything
from anywhere. I think that's
it's one of the highest points in the southwest. This is about just over 600 meters above sea level, and it is remote. It's difficult to get to. You can drive to the foot of the hill along the most atrocious tracks imaginable, but you can do it. Otherwise, it just wouldn't be doable, I don't think. But everything was going according to plan until suddenly a bead rolled out of where they were excavating.
As they do.
Yeah, and given the context, we have, I think, 70-something kists on Dartmoor, and none of them have yielded anything more than I think a flint flake or something like that, and a piece of charcoal. That's about it. Yeah. But you've got an actual bead which told you that actually there might be something left in here.
My goodness.
There was a sort of reddish mass of something that looked like fur as well. And it was at this point that they realised that actually they had something quite special, and that was when the panic set in. Because if it had been exposed to the weather, it would have just all been ruined. So they tried to get hold of the military. to see if they could help, but there was no help. They couldn't do it. Yeah, I mean, you do on Northern Dartmoor. They often help us out. So we have a very good working relationship with them. But there just wasn't anything available. They tried to get hold of the commoners, the farmers who grazed the land, but they were at an agricultural show in Oakhampton, so none of them were available either. So what they did in the end was, because they had a lot of cling film, it's something you use to wrap samples of peat in, and the peat specialist was there. They wrapped the entire kist, the base stone of it and the material inside it, in cellophane, and put it in a wheelbarrow and wheeled it off the moor. And apparently it was so heavy that you couldn't get two people on a wheelbarrow. It wasn't physically possible. But it was so heavy that you could make about 8 to 10 yards before you had to put it down and somebody else had to take over. So they had to do that for about 1 kilometre across the moorland to get to a vehicle. It then spent the night in a Land Rover, I think, outside my predecessor's house before they drove it as an emergency to Cheltenham. Is it Cheltenham? Yeah, I think it's... Or is it? Anyway, some a conservation lab up in that sort of area, and then they excavated it in the lab a centimetre at a time, and it yielded... in those famous words, wonderful things, you know.
Yes.
So, I mean, did you want me to talk about the things that were in it as a...
Well, I think as a rounding off, I mean, we've galloped through in the chronology, if you like, and we'll probably backtrack. But as a kind of rounding off, as to where in prehistory this fits, where in the chronology this burial fits, I think, is just wonderful to describe, the detail of the finds in that kist, it being so special.
I will talk about the dates, but it's a good idea to understand what was in it first, as you say. And what was in it were... I mean, the great thing about it is it was preserved in peat, which is exactly the name of the volume that describes the finds. All sorts of organic material, which we don't usually see, as you almost certainly know, on an archaeological site because it rots away. But the peat had preserved it. And to run through a quick list of what was in that, it was a cremation burial of a young... Well, a gracile individual, as they call it. We think a young woman, most likely, from the fragments of bone that's surviving. And she was accompanied in her death by, there are fabrics or fragments of fabric, including one that's a composite, I think it's nettle fibre, but combined with a leather fringe that has sort of zigzaggy triangular fringe, which is unique in Northern Europe. Nothing like that has been found. There was, I'm trying to remember it all now. That my favourites are the two or four studs that are turned spindlewood, and that's that's an example of, I think it's the earliest wood turning either in the UK or Europe. I think by about 500 years. I can't remember which, but it's certainly in the UK. And I like those because we interpret them as Lebret's ear or lip stretchers, putting in your those holes people put in their ears that stretch and stretch, and possibly the smaller ones are for your lips. Maybe that's an interpretation, and I like that most because it's a touch of human. You're touching a human there. You're touching how part of how they express themselves, how they express their identities, which is a difficult thing to access, really in a really direct way. And I love that. That makes them my favourite objects from the kist. There are also over 200 beads of baked clay, shale from Dorset, amber, obviously from much further afield, and intriguingly tin. You'd have to be... Obviously, these could be traded items, the tin I'm talking about here, but you'd be churlish, I think, not to think this is local. This is evidence of local exploitation of tin. Those are interpreted as the remains of a necklace. There's another band of intricately woven cow hair with tin studs in it, which would have been quite a shiny, spectacular piece. We think that's an armlet or a bracelet. What else? The whole thing is wrapped up in a fur, which, from what I've been told, took a long time to find a specialist to identify it, and they found one in Germany, I think, eventually, and it's a brown bear pelt. So gives you perhaps some idea. Obviously, it could be traded, but it also might be giving you an idea of just how different the environment was at this period. The whole thing, I think, was then held together with a copper alloy. I have to say copper alloy because I'm an archaeologist. I'm not allowed to say bronze. They'll sack me. Copper alloy pin about yay long. So an incredibly rich, I don't think I've missed anything out there, but I may have done. But an incredibly rich find for Dartmoor, giving you a glimpse of this period. The dates fall somewhere, we think, in the 1800 BC range, which is interesting. That's the early Bronze Age. There is a hint, and it is only a hint, I'm told, that some of the objects may have different dates, slightly earlier, suggesting they may be heirlooms. They may have been curated. And so it's an interesting period on Dartmoor, indeed across the whole country, because it's on the cusp, the very cusp of the period when we start to see roundhouses and all our reef systems on Dartmoor. So this woman, assuming it was a woman, which is the best interpretation at the moment, is of that period just before all that starts to happen, before people start to build these permanent houses and divide the land up in the rigorous way that they do in the slightly later Bronze Age. So she's at the end of a tradition of building cairns, perhaps. The peak of cairn building is probably over by this time. The cow hair. Oh, that was the other thing that was in it. Basketry, which modern basket makers, the beads were all in a basket. And modern basket makers have heaped praise on the technical skill of the people who made the baskets out of lime bast with cow hair decoration, from memory.
Something that's just occurred to me is that you speak of this boundary, then this transition, which on Dartmoor seems to much more mark this transition from within the Bronze Age, from an earlier system into the Reefs system, when people start to of field division, to put another, for want of a better description of that, and circular house building or hut building, and that seems much more pronounced than there has been from the Neolithic into the Bronze Age per se, as we tend to see elsewhere when it's obvious that beaker culture has taken over what was there before, and this seems to be a kind of a much later transition, or do we see both, just that one is more pronounced than the other?
I think the archaeology is deceiving us slightly, especially on Dartmoor, where we see this sudden appearance of these stone-built roundhouses. I mean, that gives the impression that it's a sudden occurrence, that people suddenly start building, over the course of a short period of time, building these houses and constructing reefs and field systems. And to some extent they start doing them in that way. But it's probably the result of an evolving system of living on Dartmoor that has been going on since at least the Beaker period. Excitingly, and this is news hot off the press, we've been doing some work with Brighton University, Dr Chris Carey there, who's a specialist in geoarchaeology, so looking at geological materials and trying to understand what they tell us about how people were living and affecting their environment. We are excavating a hut circle at Holwell Tor on Haytor Down near Bovey Tracy. And part of the work we've done there so far was looking under the reefs at some of the preserved soils. The reefs would be built on top of a soil, and that soil would be fossilised, if you like. And one of the conclusions we are looking at there is that before the reefs are built, we are seeing soil degradation and soil erosion already in this landscape. So that's almost certainly human activity doing that. So we're looking at a situation where humans are already having a deleterious effect on that. They're already degrading the soils. They're being washed away. So what we're looking at with the reefs and the roundhouses is potentially a system in which has developed in response or partially in response to this degrading environment.
Oh, I see.
It's not the start of a process. It's actually the end of one or a stage within that process.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
It's just that the archaeology is so solid and so well preserved that we see that, and automatically, without any other evidence, we leap to the conclusion: people started farming in this environment and enclosing land, whereas actually they've been doing that for centuries, but in a slightly different way that doesn't show up as archaeologically. That's the theory at the moment, and we've got supporting evidence for very similar processes going on Exmoor. Under the little area they have of similar reefs, I guess you'd call them. They look very much like them on Cod's End Moor, which is on Exmoor. So very similar things going on the uplands out across the board, really.
So in a sense, we owe the preservation of what there is on Dartmoor, the plethora of stone monuments and the archaeology that's buried in the peat, which is a bit of a treasure trove in itself, I suppose, if you get to examine and dig down on it. It is that
happens to me all the time.
It's all right. He needs new batteries.
It is. Oh, he's got it. It is that this erosion and depletion of the soils, which is caused by human activity, that's what has preserved this area for posterity, really, because it's been left alone.
I mean, it is. It's amazing to me more widely how often it is that places that we find beautiful. Or that have good archaeology are often places that are the scenes of ecological disasters in the past that are human-induced. Iceland's another case in point that, this huge Viking Age heritage and a fantastic landscape, but brought about by Viking settlers who've eroded all the soils, and we now find that an amazing place to be. And Dartmoor's sort of the same. They are the product of humans and nature interacting. People often describe Dartmoor as a wilderness. It's one of the things that comes up most often in surveys of, words that people use to describe Dartmoor, and it's so erroneous. It's not true.
Yes.
It's a product of human management over
in other words,
many
it's
thousands
artificial,
of years.
Yes. Yeah.
I was going to say the fact that management changes means that the Dartmoor changes in response. That's what happens. It's a balance and and something we deal with or try to deal with.
That dating of the building of hut circles and the remains we see, they're marked all over the landscape on Ordnance Survey, hut circles, hut circles, hut circles. But the later dating of that, if you're suggesting, is the implication of that is that we shouldn't be associating those necessarily with the earlier monuments, with the circles, with the stone circles, and with the stone rows, even though they're often in proximity to them.
That's right.
I mean, we assume when we look, particularly somewhere like Merivale, which so many people visit, just over the dip there, you've got loads of hut circles, and the assumption is, well, those are the people that built the monument, but it ain't necessarily so.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
I mean, given all we've said about the dating of stone rows, they are of very different dates. But what is interesting on that site and on others is that they left them alone. They are respected by, as far as we can tell. I mean, it might be there's a whole load of stone rows they've demolished that we can't see anymore. But for what we can see, I mean, one of the things, the less obvious features that runs through that site is the Great Western Reef. Now that's the longest reef on Dartmoor. It runs from Sharpit above Burrator Reservoir all the way up across Walkhampton Common to Merivale, and then it goes off north up the Walkham River and across a Tor there and up to White Tor. It ends the other side of White Tor.
Just say a bit more about what a reeve is, because I don't think we've done that.
A reeve is a land division, it's a local term for a land division of usually a Bronze Age date, Middle Bronze Age date. So around the centuries around 1500 BC. They look like low earth banks with stones sticking out of them. Some are more obvious than others. The one at Merivale, the Great Western Reeve, it's not very obvious when you get to Merivale unless you know what you're looking for. But it crosses the site, and it does so just beyond the ends of the stone rows. So instead of going right through them, it has avoided the whole site and marches off to the north.
Okay.
The Venford Reeve on Holme Moor is the same. It is like a terminal reeve. It marks the end of the reeve system. I mean, these reeves can define entire landscapes covered in fields. But the Venford Reeve on Holme Moor, just beyond it, about just a few metres, 2 or 3 metres, is a stone row. It hasn't. It's gone alongside and parallel to the stone row, but it hasn't disturbed it at all, as far as we can see. As always, there is an exception somewhere where a reef does go through. I can't remember where it is, but it does go through the stone row. But usually, you find that Middle Bronze Age people respected, or seem to have respected, and even sometimes refer to some of the earlier monuments. There's to widen things slightly, there is a hut circle on Bodmin Moor, and another I can think of on Exmoor. You sit in the middle of the stone circle, you look out the doorway and there is a barrow. It frames the barrow. I can't remember. I think that's Porlock Common on Exmoor that is the one I'm thinking of. But but you find that sort of we divide the past up into these chunks that are easy to think about and discuss. But in the past, that's not how they were experienced. They weren't experienced as, oh look, I've woken up today, it's the Neolithic, I better start farming. It's a much more gradual process than that. And people at the time, and when you start to look at the archaeology in detail, you see that the transitions are often very, very blurred. The best example archaeologically is probably the start of the Bronze Age. We can't even decide when that starts, really. And it's only in recent years we've decided that, with improvements in dating, that archaeologists have decided that actually there is actually a Copper Age that lasts a little while before full bronze starts. People start making bronze with tin.
Yes. It is probably one of the greatest failings, if it's not unfair to say that, one of the greatest failings of archaeology is our desperate need to categorise everything. And sometimes we put things into separate groups when they actually don't belong in separate groups at all. They're just different manifestations of the same thing or whatever, but we do it a lot.
It's there's another saying about the past, which is looking at the past is like looking into a well. It's very dark, and often all you see is yourself reflected back, which means
that's lovely.
It is
lovely. Yes.
God, yeah.
And what it means is we often project the way we think onto the past. And it's a very easy thing to do, to make assumptions, because that's obviously what I would do. That's what they must have been thinking, and it ain't necessarily so. They had and the further back in the past you go, the weirder they get. I always think. The more out there, but that's
I'm afraid we're going to use that, Lee. We're going to use that.
That's the fun of looking at prehistory. That's why it's so fascinating.
That's a bit of a slap in the face, isn't it? Really, it's true. That's absolutely true. I mean, one of the things that that Mike and I complain about a lot is that sometimes you can be looking at an artifact or a monument that might have been used in the most practical sense, And yet always we want to say that it's ritual or that it's deeply spiritual or that, that we put whatever fancy notions on it when there's just no reason to go there, really. We do it a lot.
I agree. However, that is us projecting ourselves onto the past again, but by the fact of dividing something into functional and spiritual. Yes. They're not necessarily different things to people living in the past, or indeed traditional societies today. Their categorization of the world could be very, very different to the way we understand it. And that's another problem. I was in a seminar recently being held by Henrietta Quinnell, who's the preeminent historian in southwest Britain. I mean, she knows far more than I. She's forgotten more than I can ever know, I think. But she was talking about Neolithic houses, and that's something that's very elusive in the archaeological record. It's very hard for us to find where people were living in the Neolithic. We see all these monuments, but we don't see the domestic side of life. And she was talking about how recently in different parts of the country, including Devon, you find these sites with lots of pits on them. And often you find bits of pot in these pits and organic material buried in them, and they are whole scatters of them. And if you look closely at the pattern of them on some sites, there are gaps in the distribution, and it could be the gaps are where the houses are, and the pits are all that's left, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
And we're interpreting, because a lot of the material in these pits seems to have been placed quite deliberately. They look like, as you say, ritual pits. Yeah. And then somebody asked the question do we have any evidence for them being latrines? And nobody's looked at that. Nobody's yet looked at that. They're relatively recently identified, but nobody's kind of looked at it. But it's a good example of, they may have been latrines, but they may have been both. Yeah. There may be something special and spiritual about them, as well as being somewhere where you dump your waste. So, if you see what I'm saying, the categorization would be very, very different to the way we understand things. Or very different to the way we would do things. Very opposite, the profane waste and latrine stuff, all the way up to something that's a bit holy and sacred. So
it's not too much of a it's not too much of a digression to point out a bee in your bonnet that you have about the depiction. The depiction of people in prehistory, on information boards or wherever, artists' impressions, shall we say, of how people were living. And, because, once you've put something down, it's there for quite a long time. The artists, all due respect, have to be a little bit careful. But at the same time, everything gets greyed down a little. I know it's something that you have particular thoughts about.
It is. I've worked with reconstruction artists, very good reconstruction artists, on a number of occasions, and seen other people's work, obviously. I mean, some periods we're better at than others. We do understand, for example, mostly we've got a good idea, I think, of what Roman Britain probably looked like.
Sure.
In good aspects of it anyway. But when you get to prehistory, it starts to get a bit... the phrase I always use, again, a bit irreverently, is that everyone in them looks like they've just come from a 1970s Glastonbury festival. Even the women have beards, It's one of my lines, jokes I always use. And although I'm being facetious, and I understand the reasons for it, I know that, artists have to go where the evidence leads them. But we also have to remember that we're seeing a fraction of what was there in the past. Probably less than 10% of all the organic material that was in use. Things like colour. It's not a great leap of the imagination that prehistoric people had coloured cloth. They had vegetable dyes. They may even have had mineral dyes that worked. We know this. So why are they all brown? They may have had decorated clothes. We've seen that at White Horse Hill with the leather fringe on something, So
and if you take into account things like the turned wood, if they are the application that, as described, that's you get this real impression of self-expression through adornment, and you look at if that was what was going on.
Exactly. You look at where I always turn is I either go to like the Aboriginal Australians with their the colours and the body paint and that sort of thing, but also native North Americans. Those cultures are many of them at a Neolithic or Mesolithic stage. Really, they're broadly comparable. They're probably not totally and anthropologically comparable, but they're doing similar things. And you think, look at the differences, the way they looked, how they expressed, the funny hairstyles, the paint, the beading, all of that stuff. We need to keep that in our heads when we're thinking about what the past looked like, I think. And there have been publications in the past about colour and how that may have what things may have looked like. So it's just worth bearing in mind, I think, when we look at these things and trying to occasionally push the envelope. I always remember being shown quite simple, a simple idea. One of my lectures, I think, when I was an undergraduate, we were talking about this issue, and our lecturer showed us this series of pictures, and I wish I could remember who the artist was because they were fantastic. And they were showing portraits, if you like, of Paleolithic people, so way back in the Ice Age. But the artist had done them in a very kind of detailed pencil drawings, is what my memory, or maybe pen, but black and white. But what he or she had done is they'd taken people from the tube and basically drawn their portrait, but portrayed them as a Paleolithic person, and they really were effective. They really looked real, like real people, because they were real people. They just put the, we have an artist at the moment we work with who works with photographs. I have no idea how he does it. Peter Lorimer, he's got a fantastic Twitter feed, I think he has, that will show you some of his work. But he does, and he's done, the Historic England page has some fantastic work by him on Stonehenge. So have a look at that, because he takes photographs and he puts them together, and he uses real people and he dresses them up. And some of them aren't quite as convincing as others, but he did some White Horse Hill reconstructions for us that are just superb. I just love them. They're great. I think one of the people in one of the pictures now has gone on to work in Coronation Street, but so I'm told.
Well,
but so
what was
really
his name
evocative.
again?
Peter Lorimer. Have a look at some of his stuff, because they are. He does everything. I've seen him do Second World War tank reconstructions all the way back to. There's a particular one on the historic environment, English heritage, historic England. Get it right. Showing Neolithic cattle herding, which is incredibly evocative. Really brilliant, effective photo. But
hopefully we can point people in that direction, or even show an image or two if it's not breaching anybody's
have a look for them, because they are often wonderful.
Yeah. Fabulous.
Well, obviously, we could talk all day, but one of the things that seems to be quite dramatic is that everything changed when there was this major climatic shift around 1000 BC. Whether it was, the moor just stopped being hospitable and people just moved down into the lowlands or whatever. Tell us about that period, because it's such a dramatic change in what was happening on the moor.
Yeah, I think possibly firstly, the only work on climate that's been done, I think, has been Tall Royal Bog. I think some of the work done from a peat sequence there. It's the only thing that has looked specifically at climate change on Dartmoor, and it's particularly at its impact on Bronze Age settlement at the time. And I think the conclusions are that it probably was a factor, but it may not be the only factor involved. The actual situation probably was rather more complicated. Look at the current situation. We would probably have little evidence for a pandemic, for instance, surviving. Either of people or of animals. That's a possible. I don't know.
Very good point. Very good.
But that work has shown that, yes, there does seem to be a real climatic downturn. It gets wetter and colder at that time, or roughly around those years, maybe a bit earlier than 1000 BC. But
is it
certainly
correct to
at that time.
say? Yeah, is it correct to say, as far as prehistory is concerned, at least that's where the line gets drawn, around about 1000 BC?
For prehistory,
yeah.
It's 1,000 years later than that generally.
Yeah.
I mean, you get proto-history where you have other people, like in the Mediterranean, writing about Britain.
But I mean, as far as Dartmoor is concerned.
As far as Dartmoor is concerned, no, probably not. I think a lot of the time there is evidence that we can't see so easily.
Yeah.
For example, we do have hill forts around the fringes of Dartmoor, which are of Iron Age.
Yeah.
Also, we have to bear in mind that studies are constantly changing our ideas of things like ceramics, for example. Yes. We have excavated a relative few of our hut circles and Bronze Age settlements, certainly in the last 40, 50 years, if I'm generous, with modern methods. A lot more were done in the Victorian Edwardian period, but not to modern standards. And all of those collections from that, particularly the earlier stuff, are still in the museums, unstudied. So we're not entirely sure what they contain. And sometimes it seems that we can see later Iron Age reoccupation of Bronze Age structures, possibly Romano British too. Yeah, so there is activity happening on Dartmoor, but there isn't the extensive settlement we see, as far as we can tell, in the Middle Bronze Age. There's a site called Gold Park on Shipley Common, which isn't far from Grimspound, where excavation was undertaken in, I think, the 80s by Alex Gibson, and he found that the roundhouses he were looking at were constructed in the Iron Age. So we could be looking at a situation where many of the things we say are Middle Bronze Age actually aren't. So, the level of research is... have you got your head in your hands? Welcome to my world.
Yes, yes. We thought we understood. We don't.
No, never think you understand. So we also have evidence, again, from close to Sitterford. Actually at Sitterford, it was from peat samples we took at Sitterford that show peaks in what the scientists who study this call NPPs, or non-pollen polynomorphs.
Lovely.
What that means is fungal spores, and usually rather than pollen or something like that, they're fungal spores, and usually what they're looking at are fungal spores that grow on animal dung. So, or as they say, coprophilic, poo-loving fungus. And what they tell you is, if you've got a lot of them, more than the background, you've got a lot of animal poo around. And that generally is taken to mean you've got grazing animals over and above the natural level.
Yeah.
And we see that in the late Bronze Age. I can't remember the exact date, but it's somewhere around 1000 BC. So are we seeing the use of the moor for grazing by communities who don't live on the moor, much as they did in the medieval period? It's a good bet, I think. It's just not a lot of work has been done on those sorts of that sort of evidence. We only have a few places where we've done that sort of work.
But the Sitterford Stone Circle could be the gift that keeps on giving, couldn't it? Because it's. I mean, for those that don't know, I'll be able to put an image or two up. But Sitterford Stone Circle is a stone circle. I mean, imagine one of the Greyweather stone circles or something like that, but completely flattened into this sort of clock face pattern, and what it seems to have happened, these stones have fallen at different times. So under each different stone, you've got the record of the time that stone fell over. So maybe in that clock face, you've got a wonderful, chronological deep dive through the whole of Dartmoor's prehistory, or a lot of it anyway. I never thought.
It's a wonderful site because everywhere in the country, pretty much every stone circle that we know about, many of which are famous, have been messed about with by subsequent generations.
Yeah.
Sitterford is an exception. It's been buried in the peat, so it hasn't been touched. Certainly not touched by the sort of Victorian Edwardians who like to put things up as they thought they should be.
Yes.
Not as the evidence suggested always. I shouldn't rag them too much because we wouldn't know as much as we do,
and we wouldn't have as much as we have.
And we wouldn't have as much as we do. No, so
so
Sitterford's a very important site that's for that reason. It's a strange one because we couldn't find any sockets when we excavated a little bit there a few years ago. No sockets for the stones, so a jerry-built stone circles just upright in the peat, perhaps.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay.
That is very interesting.
I hope over this hour or so that we've given folk the impression that although, as I said before, we look at it and we see the stone monuments, but that the prehistory and the history of Dartmoor stretches out vastly over time. Is there anything that you feel that we've missed out, or any particular favourites, or any feeling that you have, the secrets that Dartmoor is still to give up? Do you have a hunch or an inkling?
How long have we got?
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of questions that are unanswered. I think Dartmoor, despite the richness of its archaeology, just to illustrate how rich that is. In England, there are 20,000 scheduled monuments, roughly. Yeah. On Dartmoor, we have over 1,000 of them. So we have 5% of England's scheduled monuments in 0.7% of its area. So the density of that material is enormous, and much of that is prehistoric archaeology. Very large proportion of it. So that gives you an idea of how dense that is. Questions that spring to my mind a lot are: how early were the tin resources exploited? What role did that play in the wider world, if you like? Fortunately for me, that's recently being addressed by a big project on ancient tin being undertaken at Durham and Liverpool universities. They are looking at that question of how much did British tin contribute to a European Bronze Age?
Ah, great question, yes.
Largely, I think, from what I've read, fairly new information to me, that because tin bronzes, as opposed to just using copper, emerged quite early in Britain. As opposed to what was going on the continent. So they are drawing on samples and metal artifacts from all over Europe and working with European archaeologists on this question, which I hope will... And they've been doing an awful lot of sampling this year over the summer, from our streams to find tin, so they can chemically fingerprint some of this tin, or at least that's the idea. So hopefully that will tell us. We have things like the White Horse Hill tin that gives us a hint that something was happening, but how early that was happening and how important it was on a wider level is a question I'd like to see answered. I'd like to understand a little bit more about the Neolithic on Dartmoor. We're, again, another project I'm working on with Leicester University is looking at what we call tor enclosures. They're a Cornish phenomenon. We have two well-known ones at White Tor and at Dewstone, which are these stone-built enclosures surrounding tors and incorporating outcrops into their circuits, if you like. They're Neolithic. They've been proven to be early Neolithic in Cornwall at Carn Bray and Helmond Tor, the two there. Whether that's the same story here on Dartmoor and how they fit into this narrative is another interesting one. And I'd also like to know more about the Mesolithic. And as I said earlier, we know very, very little about it. That's just three off the top of my head. 3 questions that we really could do with answering.
Well, we look forward to what's going to come out in the future, and I your questions are answered. Rupert, that's all I've got. What have you got? Anything to ask?
No,
Lee?
because the time romps on, and we just could talk. Because we love Dartmoor anyway. We could just talk for hours and hours and hours. No, all I'll say is when we next get down, because Mike and I are planning on making a film specifically about Dartmoor because it's just so wonderful. So we will make a point of dragging you out.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Any excuse, as long as it's not this cold.
No,
we'll get out and have a look. I've done a few myself that are nowhere near as professional as yours. They're only a few minutes long that sometimes go up on our Facebook page of me wandering around, sometimes in the rain, looking at they're raw. They're supposed to be raw. I'm here today. Have a look at this, that sort of thing.
That's the way it should be. Yeah.
Yeah, quite.
It is the way it should be done.
Yeah.
Yes.
So hopefully they're useful for people. But, some of those are on prehistory, so you know.
Yes. No, it's wonderful. Lee, thank you so much. It's so rich. As I said, we could talk for hours. We can't. Yeah. But there we are. No, just thanks again ever so much for giving us your time, and we'll make a point of getting out on the moor with you when we can next get out and about.
Yeah, obviously we'll go and look at something.
Yeah, obviously this needs a supplemental. What better way? Yeah. So
thank you. I've enjoyed it. It's been good.
Remind us, viewers. Say, get out there, get back on Dartmoor. Yeah, I expect your comments down below. Right?
It's a wonderful part of the world. So
Oh yeah, terrific. Well, we hope we've given people that impression and inspired a few people that may not have known so much about Dartmoor to delve more into it. So with that, we will say bye-bye to you folks. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And
see you soon.
Okay, bye.